Thank you very much, Sue, for those warm words. I'm delighted to be here. Already very excited about what I've heard this morning. I thought Khalil Gibran's words, as sung so beautifully by the children, was the right place to start. Our children are not our children. Their souls dwell in the place of tomorrow, but they also dwell in the place of today, and that's one of the pesky things about children, this constant tension between our hopes for them as people of the future and our awareness of them as creatures who more than any others inhabit the here and now. Now, you'll also see some points of contact and some points of contrast, I think, with what you've just heard from Philip. I'm going to start by asking you to do something and to participate in this day. I'm going to ask you to think about your own childhoods, and I'm going to invite you to think about the kind of places you used to play when you were a child. And I want you to picture in your mind one place that you would say was your favourite place to play when you were younger. And I'd like you to just turn to the person next to you and describe that place to them in 1 or 2 sentences. And I'm going to give you about 38 seconds altogether to do that. And then I'm going to do some quick feedback, and we'll see where we are. So there you go. Your favourite place to play when you were a child. Off you go. Sorry to interrupt. Okay, thank you. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask a couple of questions and I'll just see a show of hands. First of all, please, hands up if your favourite place to play was somewhere that was out of doors. Okay. Thank you very much, hands down. Hands up if your favourite place to play was somewhere that was not under the direct supervision of adults. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to do a tiny bit of mind reading. I know the nostalgia klaxons are singing loudly, but just ignore them for a second, and I'm going to guess the kind of places you were talking about. You were talking about the woods, you were talking about scraps of land near where you lived, maybe you were talking about the far-flung corners of your garden, maybe you were talking about the street, but the places you were talking about, and you can guess I've done that exercise before, some of you will have heard me do it before, these memories are very powerful, very resonant and universal. That the most resonant places from our own childhoods are places where we could feel a sense of possibility, of adventure, where we could explore and have everyday adventures without the kind of close and anxious presence of adults. And I make no apology for reminding you of those experiences, and in doing so, I want to make it clear that I am not saying that our job today is to create a carbon copy of our own childhoods. I'm not saying that I or you or anyone else grew up in some golden age of childhood and that today's children are going to hell in a handcart. In fact, I'll revisit that idea in a minute. What I hope you take from that exercise, and the reason I do it so often when I speak or when I'm working with clients, is that I hope it reminds us of what I see as an essential ingredient of childhood. That's opportunity to get to grips with the world around us, children have an appetite for experience. They have an urge to explore. They want to get the hang of being a human being, but we grown-ups have a problem with that process. And What I'm going to do from my talk is kind of firstly figure out a bit more about what that problem is and what's going on by looking at one case study of risk in childhood, and as Sue alluded, it's around risk in play. I'm going to try and draw some lessons from that and kind of take a slightly wider view, and also share a couple of morals that I draw, really that are about, firstly, our need to rethink the way we think about childhood, and also kind of revisit the kind of environments in which, the kind of habitats in which the young of our species are growing up. But before I move on to my case study, I want to say a little bit more about maybe one of the questions that was in your mind when I just asked you to think about your own childhood, and that's the extent to which childhood has changed, and what's going on, and the differences, the contrast between children today and our childhoods and the childhoods of previous generations. Now, you often hear it said, and I think Philip alluded to it, that kids are growing up faster today. Now, I want you to think about that statement for a moment. And while that statement is that you can see that there's some truth in terms of children's engagement with culture, their adoption of adult mannerisms and styles, and certainly their engagement with technology, which I'll come on to. And that there's a kind of blurring of the boundaries between children's culture and adult culture. But that statement, as a statement about children's everyday freedoms, nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that for the past 2, 3, 4 generations, childhood prior to adolescence has been characterized by shrinking freedom of action for children and growing adult control and oversight. And here's a slide that makes this quite clear, I think. This is, what I want you to look at is the map here, which maps out what you might call the home territory or the right to roam of 4 generations of the same family who all grew up in the same area at the same age. And so this is when they were each 8 years old. So if you can see this blob that takes up most of the map, that's the home territory of the great-grandfather at the age of 8. He could travel 6 miles across the city on his own. And then with each generation at the same age, you can see the home territory or the right to roam shrinking. And you can see there, that's the home territory of the son today at the age of 8. He's actually allowed to go to the end of his street. And we know from studies that that's more everyday freedom than most 8-year-olds are given. Most 8-year-olds are really rarely allowed outside their own front doors on their own. So I want to sort of say a little bit more about, by the way, this isn't just a consequence of risk aversion. I'm going to say a little bit more about why this is happening. I hope you agree with me that this matters, that this is an incredibly significant change in the nature of, a fundamental change in the nature of childhood. But before I do that, I just want to take even a slightly further step back and offer another reflection on childhood. I was lucky enough a couple of weeks ago to hear Professor Hugh Cunningham take part in a debate organised by the National Children's Bureau on modern childhood. And Hugh Cunningham is the author of The Invention of Childhood, and some of you may have heard there's a BBC book, and there was a BBC Radio 4 programme serialising this book. And he probably knows more about childhood and the way childhood has been changing over the centuries than pretty much anyone else. And he said some striking observations at this debate. And he said that he was looking over the past couple of centuries, and really for most of the past 2 centuries, the narrative about childhood, the adult narrative about childhood, was a very positive one. And indeed, there are people right up to the 50s and 60s saying the story of childhood is moving towards a happy ending. And he said, I wonder how many people would say that today. And he pointed out that from the 70s onward, we've become in the grips of what he calls a declinist narrative of childhood. That far from getting better and better for children, things today are getting worse and worse. And now, I think it's helpful for us to think about the stories we tell about childhood. And to try and pull that out a bit, I'm just going to show you a couple of images. I'm not quite sure if you can see that very clearly. Hope you can make sense. It's sort of, at first glance, you might think this is a pastoral image of a young man, communing with nature. But then you're thinking, hang on, what's he looking at? What's that in his hand? Oh no, it can't be, can it? Yes, it is. It's his smartphone. And then the way we read this picture changes. It is a smartphone. Maybe you can't see it. And this is why the photo, it's a photo from a friend of mine. And I think we then change our understanding, our story, the story that we tell. And yet, if we look at this image, do we maybe tell a different story about how this young woman is engaging with the medium that she is engaging with? Now, some of you might be saying, well, okay, but yes, I get that there is this declinist narrative about childhood, but maybe it's true. Maybe things really are getting worse and worse. Now, if that is taken seriously, that question, if it's not just, if you like, a representation of the narrative, then I think what that is it's a plea for evidence. And I'm going to come back to that plea for evidence much later on. I'm going to sort of park it for now and just say a couple more things about childhood, and in particular come back to my map of the home territory and how children's horizons have been shrinking and why they've been shrinking. I can't go into all of the reasons why, but I think one of the most common stories behind that change is that this is about technology and the kind of increasing role of technology in children's lives. And it's encapsulated in the idea that children have become addicted to their screens. So I just want to look at that briefly. And the way I'm going to do that is going to just showcase a bit of market research that I was involved in a couple of years ago, where we talked to a representative sample of 5 to 11-year-old children about how they spent their free time. And we asked them some questions. And one of the questions we asked them was, what do you do most often in your free time? And that was the answer. And it's maybe not particularly surprising. But then we asked them, what would you like to do more often? And this was the answer that they gave. Children today have an appetite for experience that mirrors our own. And it's really important that we remember that. I also wanted to say a word about parents. And parents' role in this generational shift in childhood. And when I speak to people in the media, very often there's a really simple story. The story goes, kids are not outdoors so much these days, and paranoid parents are to blame. That's another myth I hope I'll be able to demolish for you. I think it's worth thinking about parental attitudes to risk. And that the reality is that parents are on a spectrum when it comes to risk in childhood. So at one end of that spectrum, as a parent, you can, if you wish, buy knee pads for your crawling toddlers to protect them from damage from hardwood flooring. I think £4.50 a pop, plus postage and packing. At the other end of that spectrum, you can find parents, and we've read these stories as well, haven't we, who seem to adopt a rather uncomfortably laissez-faire attitude to their children's safety. But of course, most parents are somewhere in the middle, and I just want to pick out one pair of parents and say a bit more about them. And this is the Shonrocks. Now, some of you may remember their story from about 3 summers ago. The Shonrocks were a mother and father who let their 5 and 8-year-old children cycle to school through South London. And the school in question wasn't very happy about it. And as maybe if you can see from that headline, the school actually threatened to report the parents to social services for the sin of allowing their children to cycle to school. And we're talking here about Dulwich and a very prestigious preparatory school. We're not talking about the Gaza Strip. Nonetheless, some of you may be thinking, well, 5 years old, that is quite young. Is that okay? Actually, that's not the message I want you to take away from this. The message, what I want you to learn from the Shonrocks, is that they were very clear that their decision was right for their kids and that they were allowing their kids, they wanted their kids to cycle to school because their kids were ready for it and wanted to do it. And in a nutshell, the Shonrocks rejected this parental norm, and it is still a significant one, that says that being a good parent means being a controlling parent. And they were really clear that for them, you can be a good parent and still let your kid have some everyday freedoms. So that's sort of the end of the first part of my talk, and the kind of a few observations about childhood and the way childhood has been changing. I hope the message you've taken, and what I want to underscore is this extent to which children's horizons have been shrinking over the recent years. But also in the context of other changes in children's lives, which maybe frame and place that in a context. I'm now going to look at my case study of risk in childhood, and it's that most emblematic of childhood territories, the playground. Now, playgrounds have become colonised by excessive risk aversion, as I hope these slides will show. This one, have a look at it. It's almost as if the people who created this space have taken all the stuff that will be of interest to children and put it outside the fence. Now, all the same, you might be saying, well, children do have accidents on playgrounds, and so we need to kind of make sure they're safe. And isn't it better to be safe than sorry? Now, I'm going to give you some statistics. It's really helpful whenever we think about risk to actually try and look at some numbers. So I'm going to give you some numbers about playground accidents. This is, you don't need to read all of this chart, but what this chart does, it's a like-for-like comparison of a lot of different leisure activities in terms of their injury rates. And at the top of the list is rugby, no great surprise there. And if you search for where playgrounds are on this chart, you'll have to look quite a long way down. There it is there. It's slightly less dangerous than sailing, slightly more dangerous than fishing. Now, getting serious for a moment, if we shift our statistical focus not from injuries but to fatalities, again I can share some figures with you. Over the 20-year period that I've mentioned here, between 1980 and 2000, something like 5 or 6 children in the UK over that 2-decade period died as a result of playground equipment related incidents. And I've made a comparison there for you. Over that same 20-year period, something like 2,500 children have died as a result of being run over on our streets. The actual probability of a child dying as a result of a playground accident is something like 30 million to 1 against each year. Incredibly rare. Nonetheless, we are still talking about events that do happen. We are still talking about the possibility and indeed the actuality of children dying and families losing children. And that's a sharp issue. And you can sharpen it even further by putting it into a question. And it's a question that's been put to me. And the question is this: how would I feel if it were my child? Now, I want you to think about that question for a moment. While that question is understandable as a plea for sympathy, as a way of trying to gain perspective on this risk, that question is deeply unhelpful. I think we know from our own response to tragedies in our lives that gaining a perspective on loss means placing that loss in perspective. It means moving on from the emotions that arise in the immediate aftermath of tragedy. Because the truth is that if we were always required to look at the world through the eyes of the most unlucky, we would always choose zero risk. And I think a better answer to that question question, how would I feel? And a more emotionally mature, a more emotionally balanced answer is that we would all want to feel that our collective efforts to keep children reasonably safe were well thought through and well grounded. And apart from other things, that means that we look at the time and money that we spend on different areas of children's lives to keep them safe. And I think it's the money that we spend on playground safety that's perhaps one of the best proofs of excessive risk aversion. I'm thinking in particular of safety surfacing as the most obvious and indeed the most expensive measure. And as anybody in this room will know who's been involved in playgrounds, it's incredibly expensive. Again, you can see the figures, perhaps £300 million in a 10-year period spent on a measure that, let's remind ourselves, at the very best estimates, might save the lives of 1 or 2 children. Now, you can actually think about that spending and that effort, and we can make a comparison between safety surfacing on playgrounds and basic traffic calming in residential areas. And you'll remember my comparison a minute ago. And we know, we have the research, that traffic calming is, broadly speaking, it's an order of magnitude more effective in reducing harm to children. And again, I make no apology. You can sharpen that observation. And what that means is that because we've been choosing to spend our money in one area rather than another, and let's remember it's on the whole, it's local authorities here that we're talking about, public bodies, there are perhaps 20, maybe 30, maybe 40 children who have died in the last 20 years who would be alive today if we had taken a more proportionate approach to risk in childhood. Now, you may be asking yourself, why is it that we became so risk-averse around playgrounds and play areas for children? Now, and you may be wondering why I haven't talked anything about the lawyers and the insurers and all of that. I'll come back to that in a minute. I don't think that is the heart of the problem. And in order to get to the heart of the problem, I'm going to revive another childhood memory, at least for some of you in the room, and that's the BBC television programme, That's Life. It brings a wry smile to those of us of a certain age. It's kind of lumped in. It's quite interesting. I think, a quick show of hands, how many of you in this room are not familiar with That's Life? Okay, it's a few. There'll be a generational divide and a cultural divide. That's Life was a BBC television programme. The reason it brings a wry smile is because these days it's sort of lumped together with this sort of what we loved, stroke, hated about the 80s. Sort of quite curious kitsch mixture of, help me people, talking dogs, erotically shaped root vegetables, thank you Wendy, bad poetry, but mainly it was a consumer affairs programme, and actually it was incredibly popular and incredibly influential, and it did some good work. Indeed, it was directly responsible through its campaigning around child protection for the setting up of Childline. But that's not what I want to focus on here. I want to focus on another campaign the programme ran back in the late 80s, and this was a campaign around playground surfacing and about making it a legal requirement to install safety surfacing. And in one episode of the programme, the presenter set out to demonstrate just how effective safety surfacing is, and they did so through the exercise, the experiment of taking china plates and dropping them first of all on the studio floor and secondly on some rubber matting. Now, the results of that experiment, of course, were entirely predictable, but what I want to draw your attention to and why I use this image so often is that I can't think of a better image to depict our confusion, our adult confusion about risk in childhood. That the clear message, not just from this experiment, but from the programme, was that children are irredeemably stupid, as fragile as china plates, unable to learn from their mistakes, and that the adult role was to protect them at all costs. And just to come back to the sort of the ambulance chaser issue, there's also a lesson from history from this programme. This programme was broadcast in 1989. There was we didn't have no win, no fee in that time. I'm not saying that the legal climate and the fear of litigation doesn't exacerbate the problem that I'm talking about, but I don't think it's the cause of the problem. And so in a nutshell, I suppose the approach I've and others have been arguing for is to replace what you might call a philosophy of protection with a more balanced approach. And here's a quote. We'll probably be talking a lot about the Nordics over the next couple of days, but this is a Danish landscape architect, somebody I'm lucky enough to consider a friend, who's talking about her thinking about playground safety and about the role of safety, standard safety. And she says that when the distance between the rungs in a climbing net or ladder is exactly the same, the child has no need to concentrate on where he puts his feet. And this lesson cannot be carried over to all the knobbly and asymmetrical forms with which one is confronted throughout life. So what Helle's talking about there, and we've already heard it a number of times this morning, is the idea of helping children to be resilient, to bounce back from, and to respond positively to the everyday challenges that they face. And I'm pleased to say that, as Sue mentioned, we've had some success in the UK in shifting the climate around playground safety. And so I'm now I was a little bit, shall we say, selective in my images of playgrounds that I showed you earlier. And those are they're basically sort of 80s and 90s playgrounds. I'm now going to show you a few images of playgrounds from the last 5 years or so. And I hope you'll see they look rather different to the ones I showed you earlier. And as Sue said, stealing a little bit of my thunder, it's all right because I'm going to steal some of hers in a moment. In essence, the reason this has happened is because those of us who were involved in playground safety and in thinking about playground design have for 10 years or more been arguing for a different approach. And these days it's encapsulated, it's an approach that you can read about in this document, Managing Risk in Play Provision, government-funded, supported by anybody who's anything in playground safety. And at the heart of that document is that when we're thinking about environments in which children play and learn through their play, we shouldn't be doing risk assessments. We should be doing risk-benefit assessments. And I hope you can see that that's a game-changing move. And we can see the outcome of that, partly in the playgrounds of the kind that I've just shown you. But we've just last year had the highest endorsement from the government's own safety police for a more balanced approach to risk in children's play and leisure. And you can see a quote from that statement here. This is the Health and Safety Executive saying this, that play exposes children to the realities of the world in which they live, which is not a world free from risk, but one in which risk is ever present. And just last week, I was sent a further affirmation of the reach of this, let's call it movement or trend. I'm hoping you can read this. This is a sign of a playground, outside a playground in North London. I don't know if any of you remember the kind of signs you used to see outside playgrounds. They said something rather different. Now, so what I'm saying is that by revisiting our philosophy and the way we think about children, and by moving away from what I call a philosophy of protection, that our role, our job, is to protect children from all harm, and instead adopting what I call a philosophy of resilience, that our role is to help to equip children to learn how to deal with the challenges they're going to face through their lives. That really has had purchase and is now and will continue to make a difference and to open up new territory for children. But it's not enough. And in my book, one of my messages, in No Fear, Growing Up in a Risk-Averse Society. Other books on childhood are available, but that one is too. One of my two kind of morals is precisely that, the value and the importance of that shift. But the other message is, as I said, about adopting a new vision and working towards a new vision for the environments, for the habitats, for the physical places in which children grow up. And the kind of, I suppose, the strapline for that is the idea of creating more child-friendly environments. Now, what do I mean by a child-friendly environment? I suppose it's about going back to that, remember those images of children growing up and getting to grips with the world that I showed you earlier, and that idea that, amongst other things, childhood is a journey. That childhood can be characterised as a sort of progressive handing over of risk management decision-making from adults to children. And that we need to create environments where that journey is facilitated, it's fostered rather than restricted. And that's about, yes, having good, nice playgrounds, but it's also thinking about wider public spaces, about the streets where children and the squares where they can spend time, and bringing together children of different ages, allowing the possibility of a shared, lively engagement with other people. It's also about our attitudes to children, of course, and I think we do have a problem here in the UK with our attitude to children in public space. And by contrast, I'm going to not talk about a Nordic state this time, but Germany. And in Germany, there are very strong and well-regulated rules around noise and noise pollution. But children have just been exempted from those rules. Okay, this is a BBC website story that has legally deregulated children from the rules around noise making. And I don't know if you can see that quote at the bottom here. This is from the Department of Noise Protection. We have to consider the rights of children to shout as they're growing up. Here's another image from Germany. And this is a new housing estate, or housing development area in Freiburg in Germany, which is, again, reconfigured. It's structurally changed the kind of power relationship between, in this case, car drivers and children and adults. And in doing so, opened up possibilities, liberated public space for children. May sound a bit far-fetched here in the UK, but just very briefly, one of the interesting things that I'm observing from my engagement with debates around urbanism and planning and transport, we are actually, and this is across the developed world, we are falling out of love with the car. Here in London and in many other cities, including cities in Australia and America, car traffic levels are declining. It is no longer a rite of passage for young people today to get the keys to their first car. There's a real moment of opportunity here. I just really, this is a kind of plug for our next speaker, Alice Ferguson, who's helping to pave the way for that shift with the Playing Out project, which I will not steal too much more of her thunder by saying that much more about. But you've got a treat ahead of you, that's perhaps what I'll say. So I'm going to, as I said, just step a little bit back again from that, really the kind of digested version of my book, and pull out some learning. And firstly, some things I learned about adults. And you can see them there. I hope you know that we do, and I think maybe particularly in the culture in which we live, find ourselves preoccupied with safety and with blame. We do find it very easy to lose sight of children's competences, and I think that some of us who are involved in campaigning for childhood perhaps do that. I don't know about you. I was slightly uncomfortable with some of the kind of the simplistic story about how children learn that we saw from that Australian video footage. I don't know, maybe it was just me, but I don't think children actually copy what their parents do in quite such a simple way as we saw there. To be debated, perhaps. We certainly have very skewed risk maps, and I hope you could see that all too clearly from my contrast earlier on. And we do find it hard to react proportionately to risk. And some of there are very understandable reasons for that. But nonetheless, I hope... And by the way, when I offer these points, this is about all adults. It's not just about, the underinformed or people who don't think about child development, or maybe, everybody outside of this room, because we're all quite, we're on top of all this. I think we all are prone to these stances. And just one illustration, I think perhaps the most dramatic I've come across in recent times of how some of this all pans out was this news story. Now, you might think that, particularly because of the source of this news story, that maybe it's, that you can question its veracity. Well, I can tell you that in this case, the Sun was quite correct. And I'm not going to accuse the Sun of taking the story from my website, but some 6 weeks before the Sun ran this story, I told the very same story, and it was from speaking at an early years conference where a parent came up to me afterwards and said precisely what you can see from the headline, that in her classroom, her 8-year-old daughter had been told by her teacher that they were not allowed to have best friends because of problems with some of the children falling out with their best friends and upsetting each other. Okay, and I'm also going to offer you, and it's take it as you wish, but some pedagogical principles that I pulled out from this, the work that I've been engaged with, and it's. And again, you'll hear some resonance with some of what Wendy said earlier, and I think some of what Philip said too. The importance of allowing children to engage with uncertainty, and uncertainty taken seriously. And again, that echo with Carlo Rinaldi's quote about, allowing children to follow their learning to a degree where the outcomes are not fixed. That we're attuned to children's competences. And yet, it's very easy to trot off pedagogical philosophy about kind of the competent child. But in practice, I think doing that on a minute-by-minute basis is hard but vital. Yes, we take a balanced approach to risks and benefits. But also, more than that, we foster in children, and we adopt ourselves an adventurous and an inquisitive outlook, and that when we're looking at the future, and whether the future is in 1 minute's time or 10 or 20 years' time, that there seems to me there's some intrinsic merit to that stance. And yes, we try ourselves, and again we try to foster in children. Some talk of emotional literacy. I prefer to think of emotional competence. That we have an engaged relationship with our own emotions. So I'm almost really getting towards the end of my talk, but I want to just kind of turn my lens a little bit more narrowly now and have a slightly narrow focus on one topic that has already been put up in the air, and where I'm going to try and apply some of those principles to. And it's the question of children and screens. And I'm going, this is where I steal Sue's thunder. And this is a quote that Sue passed on, or kind of has tipped me off about, from Daniel Anderson, who's a very experienced researcher and educator with a long-standing interest in particularly children's engagement with television. And this is a quote from him. I'll just, I suppose the bit that leaps out at me is the phrase that we're engaged in a vast, uncontrolled experiment with our children's environment. I don't know what that makes you feel. I have to say it makes me feel a little bit like that. In saying that, I'm not saying he's right, I'm not saying he's wrong, I'm saying that's how it makes me feel. And I wonder if that's a good starting point for us to think about the way in which children are responding to what is a vast, uncontrolled experiment. I'm not denying that's the case, but let's remember it's not the first vast, uncontrolled experiment that has been unfolding in children's lives. A very arguably parallel vast, uncontrolled experiment happened during industrialization and urbanization. And by the way, I'm not saying that we should adopt a laissez-faire approach to this experiment any more than it would have been insane to suggest that we would adopt that it was somehow right to adopt a laissez-faire approach to 6-year-olds working in factories. But nonetheless, I hope reflecting on that and on our emotional reaction to that statement helps us place it in a context. And what helps a bit more, and what certainly helped me when I was writing No Fear, was, again, trying to look at some numbers, trying to actually have an overview of what's going on. What do we actually know about how children are engaging with and being affected by when they use media? So I sought out some what I thought were valuable overviews of this question. And the book I'm quoting from here is Harm and Offence in Media Content, and it's by Andrea Millward-Hargrave and Sonia Livingston. And that, again, not only well-respected authorities, but also the method that they use to pull together all of their research is robust. It's not partial. It respects the full extent of the evidence and the arguments on all sides. It has an eye to what makes studies better or worse. And this stuff is important. And these are their conclusions. It's interesting to point out their conclusions actually are not laissez-faire. They don't say this is all fine and there's nothing to worry about. They don't say there's no need for any regulation. They don't say the content providers and the regulators and the governments can just sit back and relax because everything's fine in the garden. But I think it to me, this reads a little bit differently. And I'm going to suggest that that's kind of the response I take from their overview. And indeed, that phrase is a phrase that Sonia Livingston herself used just a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have seen some coverage in the media of quite significant study of the effect of different forms of media consumption on children based on some longitudinal cohort studies. Now, the way those findings were reported in the media was quite revealing, but I won't go into that here. This was, I would argue, and certainly Sonia Livingston, who, by the way, you should listen to a lot more than you should listen to me on this topic, was saying that there is no cause for panic in what was found. Now, I think I've got a couple of 3 or 4 minutes left. I just want to tell one anecdote, and it is an anecdote. It's not evidence, but it was present in my mind about children, technology, commercialization, and it comes from spending some time last weekend with some family friends, one of whom was a boy who I'll call Michael, who was 8 years old, and Michael showed me this. And this is the point where the room neatly splits into two. There's a bunch of you who think, what the hell is that? And there's a bunch of you who are all too familiar, I suspect, with what that is. Let me introduce you to Drill Sergeant. Drill Sergeant is a Skylander. And for those of you who don't know what Skylanders are, it's the latest must-have toy. And Michael is devoted to his Skylanders. And they're expensive, they're plastic, you use them with a Wii in some way that I'm not entirely clear about. But Michael loves his Skylanders. And it was really interesting talking to his parents about that. It's a source of great conflict between him and his parents. When we were there, he was very keen to play on his Skylanders on Saturday morning. He wasn't very keen on going out for a walk or going to the beach nearby, and certainly wasn't interested in going out into his lovely garden. But interestingly, when I spoke to Michael a bit more about his Skylanders, I discovered a few interesting things. One of which is that Skylanders are a kind of a springboard for for some interesting activities that Michael undertakes. One of which is Michael's created his own imaginary world filled with monsters and creatures. And these are not Skylanders, these are his creations. And there's some quite interesting ones. I particularly like TerraSpin there. I'm not quite sure what TerraSpin does, but I suspect I want to meet it in dark alley. But also, Michael, who's learning the piano, worked out for himself the theme tune to Skylanders, not just the melody, but the bass notes as well. And indeed, talking to Michael on the walk, it was also interesting that he had an awareness himself of perhaps some of the downsides of his devotion to Skylanders. And he talked about how he can get lazy about doing other things because of Skylanders. Now, again, I want to just, what I'm trying to flesh out here is that children's relationship with this world and this environment in which they're emerging is a complicated one. And we need to pay attention to the reality of children's engagement with it, rather than being drawn simply to kind of resting on our own stories. So I just briefly want to come back to, my declinist narrative. Because, as I said, I think if that's properly understood, it's a demand for evidence. And again, last week, the week before, we saw some evidence in the form of an update of the UNICEF study that 6 or 7 years ago, remember, painted such bad news about the UK. And actually, the story is different today. And I know I haven't got time to unpick this study, but I'm hoping it suggests to you that perhaps the declinist narrative is not the most helpful way for us to think about childhood today. And I'm going to offer you a vision that I'm conscious I'm standing next to some panels that talk about protecting childhood. I hope you can see already that I have some worries about that. I think we do need a different vision. And it's not nostalgic to think about a vision of seeing children as exploring all of the territories in which they're likely to find themselves. And yes, for me, that crucially involves exploring the real world and opening up real opportunities. And there's evidence that that is not just a pipe dream. Okay, we are seeing, campaigns organising around the idea of free-range childhoods. And so my closing sales pitch to you, as somebody who also thought carefully about their domain name, that not only should we be in the business of rethinking our attitudes to childhood, but perhaps what we most urgently need to do is not to protect childhood, but to liberate childhood, in particular to liberate childhood from some of the anxieties of us grown-ups. Thank you very much.